Hello. Welcome to Day 2 of the VCCS Assessment Teleconference. Coordinated by Deborah Banks, this conference is designed to help us with research design and sampling, and also with data analysis and presentation. I'm Sherry Robertson, Assessment Coordinator here at NVCC, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our TV studios. We're joined here by a very good crew who is good at reassuring me at doing this. It is my pleasure then to welcome you into our studio, and I'm here because Dr. Anne Marie McCartan, who was with you last week, couldn't join us as she's attending another meeting. You might remember that last week Dr. McCartan enumerated a lot of changes that have occurred in Virginia as a result of assessment. For those of you who just completed your assessment reports, which were due today, you probably enumerated a similar list for your own college. As I did that, I got to thinking about how sophisticated we have become. Also, any of you who have attended national assessment conferences have probably noticed that many times Virginia comes out on top of almost every other state. We certainly are becoming quite sophisticated at assessment. So, we have reached a point where we want to be even better at what we do, and one of the things that we needed to become better at was research design and analysis. This conference will help us with that, and here again this week are Karen Genteman and John Muffo to continue our discussion on how to design, and also I believe you'll be talking today about how to present data. Now, here is Carmen Kaya to tell us a little bit about what to expect today.
And welcome to the second session of the VCCS Assessment Teleconference. I'm Carmen Kaya, Coordinator of Assessment, Research, and Planning at John Tyler Community College.
And I'm Sherry Robertson, Coordinator of Academic Assessment at Northern Virginia Community College.
At the last session of the VCCS Assessment Teleconference, we focused on research design as it applies to assessment and appropriate measurement techniques. This session emphasized the importance of telling a story with data as well as establishing valid and reliable measures.
This second session will discuss the elements of a good survey, constructing a sample, and presenting information gained from an assessment. Once again, our presenters will be Karen Genteman, Director of Institutional Assessment at George Mason University, and John Muffo, Director of the Academic Assessment Program at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University.
Please remember, your questions are important, so call the NVCC Television Center at 1-800-777-2224 during this presentation. Welcome, Karen and John.
Well, and welcome to our returning colleagues from last week and to those of you who are joining us for the first time. As you've heard, last week we talked about beginning a research project and issues of validity and reliability. And today we are going to talk about selecting a study population, what are the elements of a good survey, and then how do you report the results once you get them. So we'll begin by talking about the very first thing you need to do when selecting a study population. We talked last week about identifying who that population should be, but today we want to focus on how many you need for a good study. I'm going to show you an overhead here that I realize as you look at this on camera that numbers are a bit small, but as I understand it, these overheads will be available to you, I believe, through VCCS, and you can use these. And again, as John and I keep emphasizing, please refer to a good reference, good statistical or research design reference book to get other numbers. What we'd like to talk about first is, and looking at this, is the selection of a sample. Let me first explain what you're looking at on this overhead. This is population size, and I'll move that up. This particular overhead shows from 10 to 750 at the bottom. Then you choose within that, of course, a confidence level, and we're going to look at 95% confidence, which is 95 times out of 100. You would expect to get similar results, plus or minus 5% in the case of this particular chart. 95% confidence level is fairly standard in educational research, and that's what we'll use here today. Let me walk you through one of these to make sure that you understand this chart. Again, realizing that this is a whole workshop just looking at selecting sample size. If, for instance, you had a population size of 100, you would need 79 people in your sample in order to have a sample size that you could be sure 95 times out of 100 that you would get the same results, plus or minus 5%. So for instance, if you had a question that asked people about the likelihood that they'll complete a program, and you get the results that 50% say they are, you can be confident, if you have these numbers, that between 55% and 45% are is the accurate true number 95 times out of 100. There's still some room for error there. There always will be. But that's how to interpret this particular overhead. Now, one of the other things you'll notice when you look at this is how, as the numbers go up in the population, the numbers that are needed for the sample do not go up correspondingly. They increase, but not at the same rate. So when you have 10 people in your population, you need 9 of them to be in the study. If you've got 750 in your population, you need 254. So the numbers are not increasing quite as dramatically in the sample size. But also, you notice that if you have, for instance, the 100 that I mentioned earlier, and needing 79, you need 79 respondents. You're not going to survey 79 people. You'll have to do more than that to get 79 ending up in that final group from which you're analyzing the data. Let me just flip this a second and show you just some of these other numbers on here very quickly. When you get up to a figure like 10,000 in your population size, 369 is what you need. So the smaller your population size, the greater the more often you should sample from the full population, take the full population rather than selecting a sample. And again, John and I were talking earlier about this idea of selecting a sample versus selecting the full population. And there are lots of reasons to select a full population. One of them is that you have to take into account the response rate, particularly to a mailed survey. This one that I'm putting up for you, I hesitate to do it because I'll tell you frankly, I have never gotten a response rate this high in any survey I've ever done. This comes from Don Dillman, who was one of the gurus in survey research. Dillman says that the initial mailing, if you do it his way, and I'll show you what that means, but it's a clearly written survey that's been pilot tested, that is laid out well, that has a cover letter, has a stamped return envelope in it, that he gets a 48% response rate that first go-around. He then does a follow-up and gets, 68%. Well, I will tell you I have never gotten anything quite that high, but it is important to keep in mind when you're selecting a sample size, if you are not going to get 100% of the population responding, which you will not get, you need to take that into account when you're selecting your sample.
Sure, I'd like to mention something along those lines too. With this particular survey response, it depends a lot on the group that you're surveying and how close they feel to the organization that's surveying them. For instance, if you're doing a survey of a professional association where people pay dues, they're actively involved, you'll get a much higher response rate than if you do a survey for toothpaste, for instance. And part of the concept here is how much involvement do I have in the survey? How much do I get back from it? How does this survey do me any good? How does it serve me, and in what way does it serve me? So in your situations, I think similarly you'll get different response rates. For instance, I know for a fact surveys of non-returning students have very low response rates, no matter where you do them. Why? Because the level of affiliation with the organization is weak. Even if they left feeling good about the organization and they transferred, feel like they got everything they wanted at the college, for instance, they either completed the courses they wanted to take or they transferred somewhere else, still there's no great involvement with the college. So the return rate on that kind of a survey is going to be much different than, for instance, if you have a survey of, say, a nursing program where the faculty and students were very close to each other, the students have only been out a year, the survey is very well done, it's easy to answer and so on. I think you can expect a much higher response rate. So in things like response rates, you can't just write down a number and say there's going to be this number is a good response rate, because it really has a lot to do with not only the survey itself, but also the audience and how closely the audience feels to the organization doing the survey.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're going to talk about selecting a sample, but I cannot emphasize too much the need to consider selecting the entire population. There are a number of reasons for doing that, and one is the issue of that we talked about last time, defensibility, being able to defend your study. There's nothing quite like having surveyed the entire population of whatever it is, whether it's entering students or alumni or whatever, to make an argument that the results make sense, that they're meaningful. When you've selected a sample, you're endlessly getting arguments sometimes about that sample and whether it's truly representative of the population that you're surveying from. Another major reason for doing a full population study is when you're reporting the results, being able to analyze the data for each program, for instance, is usually a very critical element in everything that we do in assessment. We're really looking frequently and most of the time at program level data. So if you're surveying the entire group, you're far more likely to have enough people in that that have responded to be able to analyze the data by program than if you've selected a sample. Now, having said that, there are still times when you may need to select a sample. It may be that you're doing something that's, you need to survey, all students on campus need to have some input into it. So in that case, in most cases, you will not be able to survey every single student, and you'll need to select a sample.
I'd like to add, before we go on, I'd like to add one more reason why you would want to do a population survey rather than a sample survey. And that's because a population survey gives everyone a chance to have their input. So that, and we have found this in particular, say, with faculty surveys. If you are doing a faculty survey for accreditation purposes, you want to be able to say every faculty member had a chance to make input into this process. Even if a sample scientifically is more sound, politically it's very unsound. And there are times when it's more important that people are reassured that they had an opportunity to have their say, so to speak, than it is to be scientifically correct, whatever that means.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Now, let's take a situation where you might need to select a sample for maybe the reason I just gave, that you need to get something from the entire student body and it's just simply too many students. You don't have the money to do that. The random sampling principles are very basically that each and every person in that population has an equal and independent chance of being included as a survey or research participant. And we're going to talk about two types of sampling today. One is simple random sampling and the other is stratified random sampling. Now, simple random sampling, we thought maybe we'd talk about some things not to do, actually. And there are ways to make errors if you're trying to sample from the population. One is to alphabetize your list. You know, it's easy to do that with a computer. Alphabetize your list and take every fifth one. Well, one example that I like that shows the fallacy in that is that, let's say in your particular student population, you have a fairly sizable number maybe of German students whose first or last name begins with SH. Well, if you're taking every fifth one, you're going to have a very high representation of those German students with SH beginning in their name. Now, in some cases, you may want to have a high or you may want to have the appropriate representation of those people, and that's when we'll talk about stratified random sampling. But if that's not what you're looking for, if you're looking for a simple random sample across the population, you can't order the group in a way that will give some people a greater chance, some group a greater chance of being in that population than they otherwise would have.
I had an example like that too I wanted to add. And this can happen very easily if you're dealing with, say, a list of students. One thing absolutely not to do is take a list of students and take the first 100 names off that list. For instance, often lists are sorted by Social Security number. You take a list of students sorted by Social Security number and take the first 100 or 500 names on that list, you're getting all students who basically got their Social Security numbers in the Northeast. Could very much bias your sample for a variety of reasons. That's just one example of the way not to do it. Or take the last 100, because that could bias it in a different way. It causes a geographic bias, especially the geography at the time where the student, usually today now it's at the time the student's born, they get their Social Security number for tax purposes. So you're actually biasing your sample based on where people are born, which is exactly the opposite of a random sampling process.
Exactly.
Karen?
We've talked a lot about, also, but before this presentation, John and I were talking about the many computer systems, computer programs have ways of randomizing and selecting people at a randomly. And for many of you, I think that's a good way to go. For me, it certainly is to have the computer generate the numbers and select the numbers, and I've liked that myself. I think, John, you were talking about a way that you like to do it with the last number in the Social Security.
Yes, there's a problem using random number generators if you're going to do a lot of surveys, or if now, by the way, it may not just be you, it may be other people at the college also doing surveys. And the problem is, if there are 3 or 4 surveys done in 1 year and use random number generators and you're taking fairly large samples, eventually 1 or 2 or 3 or many more people are going to get more than 1 surveys. And what happens is you start getting very nasty letters, sometimes with things put in them that they're disagreeable, etc. You get all kinds of nasty notes written to you, telephone calls, and so on. So you want to try, to the extent possible, not to have this, any individual get more than 1, or if it's totally unpreventable, more than 2 surveys in a single year. So you can't really do that with a random number generator because they are doing it randomly, so eventually there is some overlap. What we tend to do is use the last digit of the Social Security number to pull a sample. And the way you do that, Social Security numbers are not randomly assigned for the first few digits. The first 3 in particular are geographic. But the last 2 digits, for instance, are randomly assigned. You can take a 10% sample just by taking everyone who has a 1 at as the last digit of the Social Security number. Next time you do a survey, you do another 10% survey. Everyone has a 9 at the end of their Social Security number. You'll never get the same people twice, unless I can't even conceive of a case where that might happen. So as a consequence, you get much better results in your surveys. You get a higher response rate. You get less anger out in the group you're trying to survey, and it tends to work well. And particularly if other offices are doing it on campus, if there's some way you can coordinate, it really helps. One other comment I wanted to make, Karen, a mistake that's often made is that people assume that you can just go to a computer programmer and say, give me a random survey. Give me a random sample. I'm doing a survey, give me a random sample. That may or may not be true. You really need to check it out. Some people are trained to program computers, have never had a sampling course, don't know anything about research methods, and will do the sort by Social Security number and give you the first 100 names. So you really have to, you yourself have to be responsible for making sure that that sample is truly random.
In fact, we have done, when we had small numbers, maybe a couple of 200 that we were trying to select, put the names in a hat, put numbers in a hat, assign numbers to every person, and put all the numbers in a box and draw them out. It's one of those real basic pre-technology techniques that still works. So it's another just reasonable way to do it if you have small numbers and you are selecting a sample. Although once again, I'd say if you have small numbers, for the most part, you're probably going to do the full population. Well, let's talk about stratified random sampling, because frequently when we're doing our surveys, we want to make sure that either all various ethnic groups are represented. You might have one where you might have data on the religion, for instance, of your students, and you want to make sure you've sampled from all of those. But ethnicity is one that I think comes up very frequently in our studies. And in those cases, especially if you have a small proportion of your population is some group, and the example I've given here is Hispanic, and although ours has been growing rather dramatically over time, so the numbers I've given here are even smaller than what we have. But assume that you have a rather small proportion, and you want to make sure that they're represented in that final data that you've collected. You need to draw, and let me just go down this little overhead here a second, and again reiterate that stratification is used to create a greater degree of representativeness, decreasing the sampling error. And rather than selecting a sample from the population, you ensure that certain homogeneous sections of the population are represented. And as I said, ethnicity is one that we often use in higher education. In the example I've given here, I've said that if you have a Hispanic population that represents maybe 3% or something of the student body, and you're selecting, you've looked at your chart and you know you need 1,000 students in that, in your final survey sample, you'd compile a list of the Hispanic students, use some of the techniques we've just talked about, and select 30 at random. Now, you might need to take into account how many you think will actually respond and up it so that you'll have 30 in the final count. But the idea is that you do that then with every ethnic group. You take whatever their proportion is in the full population and sample from within to ensure that they are showing up in your list of people to whom you're going to send a survey.
Another example, Karen, sorry to interrupt, but another example of that might be, for instance, to go back to the nursing example, you want to do male-female comparisons in your nursing program. You have 5 males and 100 females. Well, probably the best thing to do is a population study there. But if you were going to sample, you would sample the females and then take the entire population of the males. So at least you have in your respondents some males to be able to compare to the group of females. So that's another example of how that might work.
So it depends on what the point of your study is, what you're trying to get at, and if you think this is an important factor, sex, ethnicity, or whatever. If it's likely that that's an important factor, then you want to take it into account. So just to kind of reiterate here, when you have an opportunity, you always take the full population, but particularly if the sample size approximates the number in the population. You do it if the time and money that you have available to you allows you to survey the entire population. That's what you want to go for. Don't take a sample. If you expect a low response rate from a particular group, many of you have a history. You know, you've done surveys in the past, and you know, for instance, it's not unusual to have women respond in higher numbers than men. So in the case that John just gave, you would probably survey all of the men in that group, but you particularly might want to go and get the full population. And the thing to keep in mind is that as the sample size increases, you decrease error. So it's a good reason to consider doing a full population study. Okay, what we've decided to do is go into talking about the elements of a good survey and then take questions after that. So we'll let you know when we're getting close to that point when we encourage you to call in. John and I have both done a number of these workshops on survey workshops and how to design a survey, and I guess one of the things that we started out thinking that we wanted to say to you is that you must have a good reference and good references available to you, good reference resource books. One that we highly recommend is a book by Linda Susky called Questionnaire Survey Research, What Works? And this one is available through the Association for Institutional Research. The number here is on your screen, and it's 904-644-4470. Linda's book, I'll show you actually what this thing looks like here. It's attractively done. Let's see, let me bring this into focus a little bit. Yeah. Attractively done. It's a manual, how to do it. Takes you through step by step. It's a great little resource, and we highly recommend that you get it and keep it on your shelf. There is the probably one of the, as I mentioned earlier, one of the gurus of survey research is Donald Dillman, and his book, which is called Mail and Telephone Surveys: The Total Design Method, has been out by Wiley publishers for some time. It remains one of the standards, and again, it's like the Susky book in that it just takes you through step by step in how to do a good survey. There are others that we'll just mention to you very briefly, and I picked these off of my shelf. You know, there are lots of things that you could use. The two that I'm showing you here happen to be put out by, this one's the Sage Library of Social Research, called Survey Research by Telephone. There's another one called Telephone Survey Methods by Lavrakas, and that one also is from Sage. There are lots of them, you know, and what you want is something that you can refer to. As many years as I've been doing surveys, every once in a while you need to go back and remind yourself of something, look at it again. So we strongly encourage you to get some good references and keep them on your shelf so you can refer to them. All right, let's talk now about developing the instrument. And we are talking here about mailed survey. And we're doing it primarily because this is so frequently used by assessment people. Last week we talked about a variety of other methods to collect data, and we strongly encourage you to do that. And as you heard, John and I both are big advocates of focus groups. But we know that mailed surveys are one of the things that are very, very frequently on most of our campuses. So we're going to emphasize here designing a good mailed survey. The first thing we want to talk about is developing the instrument and providing a context for questions. When you open up a survey, one of the first things that you should get is a good idea about what this survey is about, why these people want the survey, and some incentive for why you want to get it back, because it's important that you let people know how the data might be used. I mean, it's a real incentive to finish, or to go ahead and complete it. But the design of it itself should basically use, you know, brief sentences. You don't want to go into lengthy discussions about any of the sections or what the survey is about. Be brief. Make some fairly broad statements and then ask some specific questions. For instance, we've done a non-returning student survey in which we were concerned that students were going to feel offended if we were asking them, you know, why did you drop out? And besides that, we know a lot of them aren't dropping out, they're stopping out. So we tried to provide a little context saying, you know, students sometimes stop out of school, and we'd like to get some information from you about why you've stopped out. And it's useful, I think, to give people a little bit of background. Doesn't have to be detailed, but a little bit anyway, before you go into a series of questions about why they may not have returned. Another thing that you want to do is group topics together. Financial resources questions should be in one section with a nice big heading. Time spent on activities or career goals, all of those are separate sections which lend a readability to the survey. It allows the reader to quickly at a glance see what it is you're talking about in that survey. What are the areas you want to touch on? It also helps you in designing the survey to make sure you're not asking the same question twice, because if you've grouped them, then it's a little check for yourself to make sure that you're not reiterating the same thing, because there's nothing worse than, you know, completing a survey and ending up at the end and you think, haven't I already answered this question? it's a real negative, I think, for somebody to complete it. So you want to group them, and it should look good. Another a little hint, really, is to establish the behavior before asking questions about it. For instance, if what you want to know is, are they happy in their career that you assume is related to what they finished whatever program they completed. So first you need to make sure that they're working and how much they're working, and you might want to ask all kinds of questions about that. If this is their first job since school, if they were in their career before they left your institution, there may be a whole series of things that you want to find out first. You want to find out what kind of work they do, and then you can ask questions about whether or not they're satisfied in their jobs, in their careers. Again, it's just leading them into it, so they're not having to guess at what it is you really want. You've kind of laid it out, and it's clear what it is you're trying to get at. Now, demographic questions such as age and sex and ethnicity or class level or whatever, excuse me, I don't want to say that. Usually age, sex, and ethnicity are the big ones. People always want to know, do you put those in the front? Do you put them in the end? You know, intersperse them throughout? Well, for the most part, if you don't have to ask them, you don't want to ask them. What you'd like to do is change that. What you'd like to do is get that information from your institutional files. And that's why you have hopefully asked some kind of you have an identifier on the survey so that you don't ever have to ask all those things for which you have data already. However, if you don't have it, or if there's some reason why you need to put it on the survey, put it at the end. What you'd like to do is get people pulled into that survey at the beginning, and if they're first checking what their sex is, their ethnicity, it's boring and tedious, and they're not going to do it. What you want is to pull them into something. Maybe something has happened at your institution. You know, there's a change that has occurred, there's a new president, or something's been in the news lately. Use that if you can. If you can ask a question related to that, you know, how they're reacting to it, put that up front at the beginning. It's a great one to just get people sort of pulled into the survey. All those questions at the end, if they get tired and worn out with your survey, if you haven't been as clear and concise as you should have been, have those questions at the end so that if they get worn out and don't complete it, you can still use the data. You still have the data. You may not be able to analyze it by some of these other categories, but at least you have the data.
Karen, I hate to interrupt there,
That's
but
all right.
I think one of the kinds of questions that often causes a negative response at the end is the one about income. And there are two issues here, really. If you don't need a sensitive, particularly a sensitive kind of piece of data like that, like income, don't put it in, because it will hurt your response rate. However, if it's critical to your survey, for instance, often in assessment, we want to know how well our alumni are doing, for instance, by program. So it is very important. You put it in the end, but you also provide categories, and this is true of all kinds of demographic data, and really all kinds of responses. Anytime you can provide categorical data, do so. Give them a category. It's a lot easier for someone to check a category than to know exactly how much they earn even. I can't tell you to the dollar how much I earn, and most people can't, but I could probably give you a reasonable guess based on category. But again, and this is true of really of all items on a survey, if it's not absolutely necessary for the survey, don't put it in, because the rule of thumb is every time you add something, it lowers your response rate. So every single item on that survey is going to lower your response rate. So and this is probably the most difficult fight of all, is not picking up things that are nice to know.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And that actually leads into the question about closed versus open-ended items on a survey. And there are good reasons to use both. Closed-ended items have a lot of advantages for us, especially in analysis, because you've already got your categories and it eases data entry and makes data manipulation very easy. You also get standardized results across respondents. You're not having to guess at what somebody meant, or they've used an abbreviation and you can't interpret it. It just simply quickens the survey processing part of what you do. The disadvantages, however, are there. I mean, one is that respondents sometimes feel like you haven't you're not really touching on what they feel about something. Now, you obviously always have something in your response categories that gives them an out, an other, where they can write something in. But generally, you don't want people to feel kind of negative about what it is that they have been asked to respond to. You want them to be able to feel like, yes, this is a good fit for me. So that is a slight disadvantage. And also just those who value, qualitative information may react to sort of assigning numbers. They circle a 1 or they check a 3. They may react to assigning numbers to their own feelings. But keep in mind, there are plenty of advantages to having those closed items. The open...
I'd like to add one thing on that. On the closed-end items, be sure if you do have closed-end items to have one that's other. Because no matter how much upfront work you do, you will not know all the possible responses. And if you leave one that says other, please specify or something like that, you may find out that there's a big category of responses out there that you didn't know about, that you weren't prepared for. And you will only frustrate the respondent if you don't allow that. And also, you'll make it much more difficult to code in the end if you don't allow for that, because they'll be writing on across the pages and everything, and it's not an easy thing to deal with once you get the responses back.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Now, on open-ended items, there are reasons also for using the open-ended items, and some of the advantages are that you really do allow for a full range of responses. This means a lot if you're asking an item maybe you've never asked before and you don't really know. You've done focus groups, you've talked to a lot of people trying to make sure you've got all the categories, but you're not quite sure what you're going to get. That's a good place to have an open-ended item. It provides a context for a richer response, especially, again, if it's something you're not quite so sure about. It just allows you to be able to interpret sometimes results that you get just a little bit better. I know something we get frequently is a dissatisfaction with advising. And if you haven't allowed some space there for somebody to say what they're talking about, or if you haven't provided the responses, you don't know whether they mean, I couldn't get to my advisor, the advising I got was bad, I wanted a different kind of advising than what I got. So you need to make sure you're allowing for all of the possibilities, and an open-ended item can sometimes do that. The other thing that I know we both like a lot is using those comments that they write on those open-ended ones and putting them in the final report. There's nothing that grabs people more in that final report than having those quotes from students, and you get those from those open-ended items. Some of the disadvantages are that, of course, when somebody has written in their comments, as I said, sometimes you can't even read what somebody has said, and they've shortened and abbreviated. So there is a potential for researcher bias. And the other major thing, though, is too many open-ended items really cause fatigue to the respondent. I have received from my own alma mater a survey that looked to me like was a page full of blank lines that I was supposed to fill in, and I just took one look at it and thought, there's no way I'm going to ever get time to do this. So few open-ended items are great, but limit them. All right, we want to talk about survey design and layout, and these are just a few items. We could, these are whole workshops again. One is to just pay attention. The overriding thing is to pay attention to style and presentation. What you want to do, let's see if we can make this any clearer here, is that the layout should be actually more vertical than horizontal. So for instance, you want to stack these responses like this, so somebody's just going down the page, not having to read across. They go down and check as they go down. You want to incorporate a lot of white space and use margins. It's hard for us to do that, but it's really worth it in the end because it can increase your response rate. Sometimes you can use a slightly smaller type, not the standard memo size type, and it has a little more professional look to it. It looks a little bit less amateurish. Instead of using 8.5 by 11, use a 17 by 11 and fold it for a booklet type survey, just to add interest and make it more appealing. Add graphics if you can. Do anything that you can that makes it look a little more interesting, and when somebody opens it up, they really pay attention and don't just throw it out. I mentioned before the headers for each of the sections, and it's very important to do that so people know what they're getting into, and it adds visual appeal as well. Keep it short. We always say that, and everybody knows that it's the hardest thing that we do is eliminating unnecessary questions, because there's always one more that we want to add. And we emphasized last time the need to pilot test your questionnaire. We can't say it enough. It's absolutely essential. Have other people proofread and proofread and proofread, and then use the very best paper and reproduction services you can afford. It makes such a difference when somebody receives that in hand and it looks like it's professional, looks like it's good quality. So those are some important things about the design. Now I think we're going to try, I'm going to talk just a little bit more about something else, but I want to give you the phone number so that you can begin formulating questions we are glad to have. We also would love to have you call and give us some experiences that you've had that are related to this, or if you've had some creative solution, that would be great too. But the number to call is 1-800-777-2224. Now I want to, while we're waiting for those calls, I want to go into the Don Dillman, who I mentioned before, the guy who's been doing this for a long, long time. Some of the things that he recommends when you're doing a mailed survey. The first thing in the initial mailing is to make sure that you have a brief cover letter along with a stamped return envelope, along, of course, the survey. About a week to 2 weeks later, a postcard reminder, and about 3 weeks after the initial mailing, a letter and a replacement survey. I know some of these cost money, but you want to make sure that you're not just sending them saying if you need one, call. Some people will call, but it'd be much better to send another survey if you can. That's why it's important to track the returns as they come in, so you don't have to spend a lot of money on sending them to people who've already sent them in. Now, Dillman also recommends doing certified mailing. I've never done that because I've never had that much money on any survey I've ever done. But I will tell you something that we've done that I think works very well, and that is to put on your first mailing, use first-class mailing, not bulk. Bulk mailing, you do not know where bulk mailing is going. I do know that it sometimes sits in the post office for weeks. So you want to go first-class mail. If you can, address correction request. We have discovered that sometimes when we send out the first mailing with that on it and nothing comes back, we assume the person didn't respond. When we send out the follow-up postcard, it comes back with a new address on it. Well, we would have counted that first person as a non-respondent when indeed they never got the survey. Okay. Okay, yeah. Let's go ahead with the call.
Yes, my name is Julie Adams, and I teach at Germannic Community College. My question is, I would like to survey the students at the college, and as far as determining the population size, which group do I use? For example, do I use total population, or do I use the FTEs to determine which is the population size that I need to make sure I have the appropriate number of people that I'm using as my survey, or the people I'm surveying?
Well, it's pretty difficult to survey FTEs, but I think that the real question that you have is, do you want full-time students? Do you want part-time students? Do you want only degree-seeking students? It really depends on what the issue is. If your issue is something about transfers, then obviously you just want the transfer students, or degree-seeking students as an example. On the other hand, if you're trying to get a general sense of how people respond to their experience there, and that would include part-timers, traditional age students, non-traditional age students, and so on, then you want to go with a head count number. At least that's my perception.
I would say exactly. I think that's really the question also. You're really always talking about, warm bodies in your full population. But if you really need to have, the differentiate between part-time and full-time, you may need to do the full population if there's no way of identifying them, but you should be able to identify them through your registration records and be able to if you have, for instance, the majority of students even who are part-time, well, you want to make sure those are the ones you get if that's critical to your study, and I think many times that is.
And one of the things you're going to bump up against in all these cases is your own university data systems. Do you have good home addresses, for instance? I mean, in our case, most of our students are residential. We send to a local address, and the local address is Taiwan. I mean, just because our data system is somehow or another has not captured the true local address. Telephone number. We have, maybe I'm telling stories out of school here, but we are doing telephone surveys now of seniors, and we find that we don't even know where a lot of the seniors are. Our Center for Survey Research is calling the parents, asking them what the local phone number is, and the parents are becoming very irate, saying, my student is there and you don't even know where they are. Well, fact of the matter is our data system is not very good at following home addresses and home telephone numbers for students, particularly as they move from year to year, apartment to apartment, and so on. You'll find all the quirks in your data systems will pop up in this kind of a situation, believe me.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the story I was saying before about using first class and address correction requested, I cannot tell you what a difference it has made for us. We were always getting these horrible return rates on alumni surveys until we found out that we didn't have good addresses for 40% of them. I also feel like I'm telling tales out of school here, but we have some pretty bad addresses for a lot of our alums.
Okay, we would still welcome, I think at this point we'd still welcome some telephone calls. The number is 1-800-777-2224. So please feel free to give us a call. We'd like to hear from you. We don't exactly know what the issues are out there in some ways, and we'd like to hear more about what you see the issues are and what questions or comments you have or unique situations that you've run into. Okay? I think at this point, Karen, I'll take over with the presentation of results, telling a story. What I'd basically like to do is just show you some examples of ways of telling the story. In a way, we are taught in graduate school to write in a certain way that basically you have to throw out when you actually start trying to communicate with people, in my experience at least. Particularly an assessment coordinator where you're trying to communicate with a broad range of people, a wide group of people. So I guess what I'd like to do here is just give you some tips using let's put it this way, using some examples from things that we've done or I've done, and also some others that I've picked up along the way. One thing you should try to do is use demographics whenever possible in putting out a report. Here's an example of one report that we've done at Virginia Tech, and a couple of points I'd like to make here. First of all, before I get to the demographics, is the issue of executive summary. A number of years ago, I worked at a state level in another state, and my boss, the executive director of the state agency, used to say, you know, if you're really, really lucky, some legislator's assistant will read the front page of whatever you produce. Well, this broke my heart as a researcher, you know, putting weeks and weeks into a study that I put out there, and hearing that only if I'm really lucky, an assistant will read the front page. But in fact, he's right, and he's no less right in terms of doing a study on campus, doing an assessment report, or anything else. So the first thing we have to try to do is summarize as briefly as possible, in a very concise way, and also, if possible, hard-hitting way, what the results are. So here's an example of a study. It's a report on entering freshmen at Virginia Tech. And basically, the way I've summarized this is as follows, and some of this gets into my own observations. I'll tell you what, before we get into this, we have another telephone call, so let's take the call first, and then we can get back to this executive summary after that.
Go ahead, caller.
Yes, this is Miriam Lockard from New River Community College. John and Karen, could you talk a bit more about what you can do after 3 mailings on a mail survey when you still have a low response rate?
Oh, isn't that frustrating? Well, there are some things you can do. One, if you have the resources, you can follow up with telephone survey to those non-respondents to find out what's going on. Another thing you could do, frankly, is to contact some of the people even who did respond to find out what's going on. Obviously, something is happening. If you've sent out 3 mailings and it turns out that you have still a very low response rate, something is going on that may be related to bad addresses. As I've already said, that could be one real issue that you will not know unless you have done some of the things that I was mentioning earlier. First class, address correction requested. If you've done bulk, you'll have no idea. Another, though, is to follow up with the phone survey. And another is to then maybe talk to some other people, find out what's happened, if they've had the same experience, if this was a new survey that a group you've never done before, and it may be that you went about it the wrong way. Maybe it was you were doing businesses, employers, and it was too long. The survey was just too long. And maybe that they needed to have phone calls and not something that they filled out. There could be any of a host of things that could have been wrong with that. And I would look into all of those possibilities.
I would only add that, again, it depends on the topic. If it's a non-returning student survey, I think you have to understand you are not going to get a high response rate, unless possibly you call, and even then you're going to have tremendous problems tracking people down and so on. They really don't want to hear from you at that point, in most cases. And you just have to be realistic. If you look at other kinds of studies similar to what you're doing, and you find they have very low response rates too, the probability of you getting over 50% when the best other study you've seen is right at 20%, you're probably not going to do it. You just have to learn to live in some cases with the reality that this kind of a survey doesn't yield a high response rate. Okay. Let me go back briefly, if I might, to the issue of demographics and the executive summary and so on. This is a copy of an example of a study that, or a summary of the data from the entering freshman survey from Virginia Tech. And the executive summary, in this case, actually made some very general statements, but also some tried to get some hard-hitting kinds of statements to get some interest in the report itself. I said that our students are politically conservative, relatively affluent, inclined to prefer quantitative subjects, less likely to have prior work experience, and more likely to have been late for class or not completed homework on time in high school. Now, right below that, by the way, I have the demographics, which was the lead-in here. I have some demographic information right at the beginning of this to say what do our students look like? Well, they tend to be traditional age, 18 years old. They tend to be residential because most of them are over 100 miles from home. We tend to be relatively selective. 92% had grades of B or better. And here I'm comparing to our norm groups, peer group, to give some context for that. How do we compare to other institutions like our own? Now, you couldn't get away with making these kind of broad, sweeping statements, as I did here in the executive summary, without having behind it some data. What I'm trying to do is bring in the reader, so to speak. Pull in the reader, get the reader's interest so they'll go back and read some of those numbers. Otherwise, often people are confronted with a bunch of numbers and they refuse or are just simply incapable of getting at the data. Now, here are a couple things not to do. This is from the same study. I had in the executive summary, I had an asterisk, and in the asterisk I said, well, in this case, the asterisk means go to the end of the report. At the end of the report, I say where the data came from. In this case, the Central Institution. Oh, I have it wrong here. It's Cooperative Institutional Research Program. Sorry about that. We went through that last time. It's the Cooperative Institutional Research Program at UCLA. What I didn't do, was very critical and left off, was I didn't give basically a response rate. In this case, it's the percentage of freshmen in the percentage of the freshman class who completed this survey. So really what I should have done, either up front or here at the end, is said we have this represents roughly 73% of the freshman class. And that was a critical piece of information I left out.
I think, John, this is important to point out, and congratulations for pointing out your own errors, because we all do this. We all make mistakes. We do something later, we think, what in the world were we thinking when we did that? Which is why you always want people to take a look at what you're doing, to read what before you send it out. Somebody else ought to take a look at it and identify some of those real obvious things that you find later.
Here is, back to this point of communication, and to kind of continue this point, here's something that I've done that I mentioned last week that we do in our office at Virginia Tech, but I think it's been very effective, and I think that because I've been getting some fairly positive comments. Bi-monthly, or once every 2 months, we send out a little front and page report, front and back page, one-page report, front and back, on topics of interest to our faculty and staff and students. This is one, actually, is probably the one that I've gotten the most positive response on. Now, we call this Quality Improvement in Action. That's probably not a good title because I'm not sure it really speaks closely enough to assessment. However, by now, it has a certain continuity for our faculty, and I'm not sure I want to change the name of the logo because now they know what this is, and many of them do read it. What I've done here is created something like you would see in the back of a magazine, Parade magazine on Sunday or something like that, that says, test your sex appeal or whatever crazy thing it is. Well, this is test your knowledge of freshman students. And so I'm conveying information from the freshman survey, but I'm doing it in a testing kind of way. So I present a question that the freshman answered and gave them 4 options, and then you score yourself, and this is, of course, on the honor system. And at the end, I even have a little rating, and as a matter of fact, if you're 0 to 5, you're a Wahoo, and then if you go above that, you're a VMI cadet or whatever, and you're a senior Hokie or something like that. I mean, it's a silly kind of technique, but it actually works. I've had people stop me on campus and tell me what their score was. And one of the problems that we've talked about is getting feedback on our communication mechanisms. Often we don't know how many people read our reports or what effect it's having or anything. In this particular case, I'm getting people coming to me and say, hey, I really thought that you were a little tough on the grading there, that 0 to 5 was too, you should have been 0 to 10 or something. You know, I missed 20 out of 25. I'm really upset about that. So it's a technique that really seems to work in terms of people remembering things. Again, we have to practice what we preach. We know that if people are involved in their own education, they learn better. This is a way of involving people in their own education. In this case, the people are faculty, faculty and administrators and staff. This one, one of the other really positive things that happened with this one is not only did I give them the student options, as you can see here, but in the end, I gave them the correct answer, but I also gave them a statistic in reaction to this. Now, let me give you an example. The first question is, how many 1994 freshmen believed that there was a very good chance that they would change their major field of study? The correct answer, I think, was something like 14%. So if you circled 14%, you got a point. But also, I said, by the way, 61% of our students change majors at some point in time. So it really was educational in 2 different ways. First of all, it really gives you a sense of what they're thinking, the entering freshmen, but also it gives you a sense of how unrealistic that is. And the whole pitch here, the whole theme of this particular one was they're too confident when they come in. And that's part of the problem. Part of the problem they have, part of the problem their parents have, and so on. And by the way, this is something we've used in parent newsletters and so on to help educate parents as well, giving parents some data. The one on majors is a really good example. Parents are shocked when their sons and daughters want to change majors, but in fact over half do. So it's a really good idea to give them that information up front. And we have a parent newsletter and a little parent guidebook, and these data go into that.
I have to tell you this, I had not seen this before, and I like it a lot, and I guarantee you'll see that with the George Mason logo over the top. And this is to say that we are shameless with this. We borrow from each other all the time, and we encourage you to do the same. There are just so many good ideas out there, and my knowledge of the assessment community is that we're all quite generous with this. So I think this is a terrific idea. I like it a lot.
Along the lines of shamelessness, here's something that it was produced by Virginia Western Community College, David Hansen, and by the way, I did get his permission before I used this. But David has a newsletter that's somewhat similar. Several really positive things I think about this. First of all, it uses a little clip art, nothing very complicated, but many of us now have access to this in our PCs. So he has a little clip art here. This particular one is around a series of questions. These are the typical questions that we get. How many developmental students do you have? And then he has a paragraph explaining that. How effective are developmental courses? And then a paragraph explaining that. He has some text as well as the numbers. I think it's a little more in-depth analysis than some of the things that we do. What are your retention and graduation rates? Another factor I really like about David's piece is he has a little cartoon here. In this case it says raw data, and then it has the cook here, and then barbecue data. Well, this lightens up the message a little bit. And again, I think it's something that we're discouraged from doing probably in our more formal training. But I think really if we're going to communicate, I mean, we're competing against MTV, and it's hard to do if you don't lighten up this stuff a little bit. Back to ways of presenting data. I really think that one of the most effective ways of presenting data are with graphics. And I've got a few here just as examples of graphics that I think tell a story. This is one that we used in one of our newsletters, and this one will have to back off a little bit. This one I like a lot because it's an example of a line graph. The reason I like it a lot is as follows. You can probably you may not be able to read this, so let me just show you what this says. This is from the Survey of Entering Freshmen, and by the way, we parallel the national trends very well. This is on the bottom. It's 1972 to 1992, so it's 20 years worth of data from entering freshmen at Virginia Tech. And the two questions are, how important is it to you to be well off financially and to develop a meaningful philosophy of life? And the reason I like this so much is you can see the effect of the 60s. Here in 1972, just a little over 40% said it's very important to be well off financially, and that line goes up, crosses in about 78, crosses the other line, and continues, and there's still a big gap out here in 1992. Develop a meaningful philosophy of life. Almost 80% of the freshmen in 1972 said that was important. Again, crossed in about 78, and it's down around just a little over 40%. These basically traded places during this period. And actually it's one that's more or less a favorite for the cheer people. They published something quite similar to this line graph. But it really shows you that trends do change over time. These are different students. They have different value systems, different things are important, and so on. And it really, I think, sends a good message. A line graph like this is very good to use when you're looking at data over time. I have an example here of a pie graph. It's called a pie graph, obviously, because it's circular like a well-made pie should be, I guess. This is one I think that many of the colleges would be interested in. I know that it's a topic of discussion among the colleges, and that's current employment status. This was in '93, about a year after they graduate. What's the current employment status of Virginia Tech graduates? And one of the issues here is, are you working in a field related to your major? So rough 59.3 or 60% over here are working in a field related to their major, which was we were quite happy to hear. And then another 25% have full-time jobs in fields unrelated to the major, in jobs unrelated. And then there are a couple of other categories here, or three other categories: part-time unrelated, part-time related, and non-employed. It's a little bit busy. An ideal one would have maybe only 3 or 4 of these. But the point is here, if you've got, and as Karen pointed out to me earlier, I hope this adds up to 100%. I didn't double check it. It should add up to 100%. But if you're trying to report things that are proportions of 100%, a pie chart is a very good way to do it. Now here's a bar chart, and this is from a survey of current students, and the question was, I think the question was something like, in the last year, have you used a dictionary or thesaurus? Well, unfortunately, in 1994, our students were even less likely to have done so than in 1991. So we've seen a decline in the use of dictionary or thesaurus, although part of this may be due to computerized spell checkers and that sort of thing. But we're still not sure. We're not really happy with this result. Also, our comparison to a group of doctoral universities, their group, the comparison group of the Norn group is over 70%, and we're under 70% in 91 and even lower in 94. So this shows somewhat of a negative trend, but it's not a trend over time. It's a trend, it's a categorical comparison actually, and not a trend over time. Okay, then I wanted to talk just briefly here about tables. This is an example of what not to do. Now this is taken from a doctoral dissertation, former graduate assistant of mine, and I was actually on the committee, so I guess I share some of the responsibility. But let me point out a few things here. A good example of how not to present data, okay? The descriptors aren't even fully spelled out, the column descriptors. Demo chair, I think that means demographic characteristics. But here I am years later, and I don't even remember myself what it meant. So this would not be the kind of thing you would want to put in front of a group of people who are not intimately related with the research. Non-trad chair, I assume that means non-traditional characteristics, but again, I could even be wrong on that. Tote, T-O-T, rather than T-O-T-A-L. I mean, that's just silly. That should have been changed a long time ago. Statistics to the 4th decimal place. In our work, we should not be doing anything to the 4th decimal place. Our level of precision is not that good, as several of our faculty pointed out to me in some other studies I've done. I've reported much less past the decimal point than I used to. 3 sets of rankings on one page. It's simply impossible, I think, for most people to absorb that kind of information, sets of rankings. And they're not in any order. You've got to actually order them in your brain. I mean, the numbers are there, but it would have been much easier had they been rank ordered over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, they were just kept in a certain order, a rigid order, and then written across. Even the heading, summary of capital R squareds. Well, that might be fine for the dissertation committee, but this should have said something like summary of multiple correlation. So that's a good example of what not to do. Now I have one example here of I thought was pretty good. Again, this is small, I understand, but this was taken from an article that a colleague and I did for a placement journal. And the editor of the journal actually produced this for us, and I think really helped a lot. First of all, there's no reason to keep the questions in the order that they were given in the questionnaire. So he sorted them from highest to lowest. Well, right away you get some sense of what's most important and what's least important. And then over here, we have the mean values, so we actually have the raw data, or I mean the summary data, sorry, the summary data, but we have the data from the report. Then we have the scales, not at all, not very, moderately, and very. But then you can get a good sense of pattern here. So you can see not only what's most important, but how far it is from the next most important, how far it is from the third most important, and so on. So you can see there's a little break in here. These are much more different than these, which are quite similar, for instance. So I thought this was really a good presentation of data. There's really a lot of data here, but it's presented in such a way that you can just look at it briefly and get a good sense of what's going on with the data.
Yeah, I like this one a lot because I like being able to reorder things and not just take them straight from the survey, which is our tendency sometimes, but to put them together in ways that make them a more telling, meaningful story. And I like rank ordering the listing and not as in the bad example of having the reader have to search through and do it. I like that one.
Okay, a couple other comments on that, and then we'd like to go to the phones again and see what kind of comments, questions, problems you have at this point. Karen mentioned earlier quotes. I think it's very good to be able to put a piece of data out there, to put a summary statistic or whatever. People will not remember that summary statistic, the number, usually. What they will remember is the quote. The summary statistics about advising might say it's the most important issue or whatever, but what they'll remember is the student saying, I went to my advisor's office 3 times and couldn't find the advisor. Or that my advisor really tries hard, but he really doesn't know anything about the job market. If that's what a typical quote is, use that typical quote. People will remember that when they won't remember 3.5 on a 4-point scale or a 5-point scale, whichever it is. So I agree very much with Karen. Put the numbers out there to back up what you're saying, but then have a quote that people can remember. Another thing in terms of using statistics, remember the audience. Think about the audience you're trying to communicate with. If the audience is a very general audience, and even in our case we have a lot of faculty in non-quantitative fields, don't lay out about a bunch of complicated statistics out there because they won't understand it. Don't put a capital R squared up there. Don't even talk about multiple correlation because it will only turn people off. They think you're trying to get fancy with them. They think you're trying to overwhelm them somehow. And they don't appreciate it, and you miss accomplishing what you're really trying to accomplish.
You really do, because you get the people who don't know what it means, who then feel intimidated by it, which is the last thing you want to do. Or you get the people who do know what it means, and they want to argue with what you've got. So it really, I think it's a loss to try to do that. And I think basically if you stick with frequencies and means and standard deviations at the most, but frequencies seem, I have to say, those are the things that I've reported that have been quoted more often, is the frequency, not a mean, or certainly not an R squared.
I think we have another call.
Hi, this is Becky from Danville College. I had a question regarding sampling, and I was wondering, how do you deal with a biased sample?
How do you deal with a biased sample?
Yes.
Well, first of all, you take all those steps that we talked about so it won't be biased, but what you want to do when you get it in, you have to check and see if it is biased. I mean, and one simple thing is just simply to eyeball it on various demographics. You know, have you got about the proportion of men and women in the sample as you do in the population? Same for ethnicity and whatever other characteristics are relevant. So that's the first thing, is to make sure that it fits pretty closely with what it ought to look like. Secondly, if it turns out that you do have something that you've gotten more women, which is very typical, by the way, on surveys, is to have more women responding than men. One way is simply to say in your report, you have a biased sample. There are more women who responded to this than men, and that should be taken into account when interpreting the results. And whenever that happens with us, it's right up front. We put it up there right away so everybody knows that that's the situation. To tell you the truth, I think most of the remedies for that have to occur beforehand, where you have to make sure you've included enough people in that sample to begin with.
I think limitations of the study should be right up front. And again, I think it's being honest and fair with the person reading the study. And in the end, it'll really pay off because people know that you're being very, very thorough. One of the things I would suggest doing is digging around a little bit. Let me give you a very simple example. About a year ago, we had some data come back from our Center for Survey Research, extremely competent, extremely professional group of people. I looked at the data and I said, gee, here's a really interesting thing. We had 55% female respondents and 45% men. That's exactly the opposite in our student population. Isn't that interesting? I'm really surprised. And by the way, it was a fairly large sample. It was an N of 600 out of 1,000 or something like that. They went back and found out they had a coding error. And then, in fact, they'd miscoded. And in fact, the respondents almost perfectly represented the population because the respondents were, in fact, 45% female and 55% male. So sometimes a little simple thing like that could have really ruined our results had we gone out and started making some statements by gender and so on. We really could have been embarrassed by the whole situation.
And it is another reason why also we talk about increasing that sample size so that you'll decrease the likelihood that something like that will happen. Again, I hate to say that you have to sort of deal with it up front, but it really is. But as John and I think are both saying, if it does happen, be upfront about it. And unless it's just absolutely drastic, I would just be upfront about it and still report it.
That also gets into the issue of generalizability. The question being, how much do you generalize the data, especially if you have a small sample, small n, as we say in the business. how much you generalize from a small sample. Well, I think that you have to be very careful about doing that, but at the same time, I think you have to be clear, honest, and open up front, but don't apologize. There's a tendency, if someone wants to fight with you about the results, they'll fight with you over the method rather than the result itself. And sometimes we have to say, okay, there's a disproportionate number of women in the respondents, there are a disproportionate number of engineering majors among the respondents or whatever. But that doesn't mean the data are worthless. That doesn't mean that because of that, we're throwing out the entire study. And you have to be a little bit hard-nosed, I think, about this. When people come in and say, well, wait a minute, there's this problem with the study, this problem, and so on, my response is, fine, show me some data that contradict what I've said. Give me something other than your opinion, because some data are usually better than no data whatsoever unless they're done in a very biased way, collected, reported, analyzed in a very biased way. As long as we try not to be biased in what we're doing, we try to be as objective as possible, I don't think we need to apologize for whatever problems and weaknesses we have in the process just because we're working in the real world rather than in a laboratory somewhere.
Okay.
Are there other questions at this point?
Okay, well, I'll tell you, if we have just a minute here, one of the things I thought we'd do if we had some extra time, and again, we keep saying this, but we'll repeat it again. We are obviously just touching on the highlights. You need to explore the workshops that are available at the state, the region, and nationally. And we mentioned last week, the Virginia Assessment Group meeting in November, Southern Association for Institutional Research meeting in October in Roanoke, and the Association for Institutional Research meeting in Albuquerque in the spring. You have to explore these because everything that we've talked with is the subject of a full day's workshop in some cases. We've just barely touched on it.
Okay. I think we're just about out of time now. What I like to do is just reaffirm what Karen said. You're not alone out there, even though it seems like you are sometimes, because I know I feel exactly I feel the same way. I feel alone a lot of the time, but we're not. There are a lot of us out there working on these topics, and please learn from others. Don't reinvent the wheel, and use all the resources that are out there already. So at this point, I'd like to go to the wrap-up with Sherry Robertson.
Thank you, Karen and John. You packed a lot of information into such a short period of time. As you pointed out, good research is absolutely necessary if our assessments are to be useful and to be taken seriously. I particularly enjoyed the examples you gave, especially the examples of what not to do, and I thank you for not using anything that I had done. For those of you in the audience, please know that sets of these tapes are available through the VCCS. You can contact Linda Carr at her email address, which will appear at the beginning of the credits. Thank you for those of you who called, and I also want to thank the studio crew here. And of course, Deborah Banks for coordinating this, and Carmen Kaya for helping to put all of this together. And I hope to see all of you at VAG in November.